Undercover owner saw black waitress with a broken hand in his diner. What he discovered left him stunned. The sound of shattering plates cut through Murphy's diner like a gunshot. Felicity Stokes, the black waitress, stood frozen, staring at the wreckage at her feet, her white cast making it impossible to catch what her trembling hand had dropped. "Are you serious right now?" The customer at table 4 exploded from his seat, his face burning red with rage. "3 times this week. 3 times. Maybe you should find a job you can actually do." Timothy Jones, the undercover owner, right there in his own restaurant, gripped his coffee cup so hard he thought it might crack. Sitting in booth 7 with his baseball cap pulled low, the multi-business owner watched his employee drop to her knees, desperately gathering broken ceramic with her one good hand while forcing a smile through tears. The other staff rolled their eyes. Customers looked away. No one helped. That's when Timothy pulled out his phone and started recording. He had no idea that what he captured in the next 60 seconds would completely shatter everything he thought he knew about the woman struggling on that floor. Because Felicity's broken hand wasn't just an injury, it was the key to a secret so heartbreaking, it would expose a culture of cruelty that Timothy never knew existed in his own businesses. Do you believe everyone should be respected? Type respect in the comments and subscribe to the channel. Only those that don't respect others won't subscribe. What he found out about why Felicity's hand was really broken and the systematic abuse happening under his own roof was about to turn his entire business empire upside down. Have you ever wondered what really happens behind closed doors when bosses think no one's watching? Because sometimes the most successful businesses hide the darkest secrets. Timothy Jones hadn't always owned a business empire, spanning restaurants, retail stores, and warehouses across 5 states. At 45, he could still remember the sting of washing dishes until his hands cracked and bled. The way his stomach would growl during 18-hour shifts when he couldn't afford to eat the food he was preparing. That was 29 years ago, right after his mother died, and left him with nothing but bills and the determination to never be powerless again. But success had distanced him from the day-to-day realities of his businesses. He relied on regional managers like Wilson Hayes to oversee operations. While he focused on expansion and profits, Wilson had been running Murphy's Diner for 3 years, and the numbers looked good on paper. Customer satisfaction scores were decent, turnover was within industry standards, and complaints were minimal. What Timothy didn't know was that Wilson ruled through fear and intimidation, creating a toxic environment where employees were too terrified to speak up about problems, injuries, or unfair treatment. Now, sitting in that worn vinyl booth for the first time in months, Timothy studied Felicity as she finished cleaning up the mess. Most business owners stayed in their corporate offices relying on reports and numbers. But recent rumors about Wilson's management style had reached Timothy's ears through whispered conversations at industry events. Other restaurant owners had hinted that his efficient operations came at a human cost. His recent divorce had left him feeling more isolated than ever. Sarah, his ex-wife, had accused him of building an empire on the backs of people he never bothered to know. "You've become exactly what you used to hate," she'd said during their final argument. "A boss who sees employees as numbers instead of people." Maybe that's why he found himself here, disguised and observing, trying to understand if the rumors were true. Felicity Stokes moved between tables with a grace that defied her obvious struggle. At 28, she had the kind of smile that could light up a room, even when pain flickered behind her dark eyes every time she lifted a plate. The white cast on her left wrist looked fresh, maybe 2 weeks old, but she never let it slow her down. Not visibly, anyway. Timothy watched her approach table 12, where Mrs. Patterson sat with her usual scowl. The elderly woman was notorious among the staff for her impossible demands and microscopic tips. But Felicity's smile never wavered, even though Timothy could see Wilson watching her every move from the manager's station, his expression cold and calculating. "Good morning, Mrs. Patterson. The usual today? Make sure the eggs are over easy, not over medium like last time. And I want real butter, not that margarine nonsense. And the toast better be golden brown, not burnt like Tuesday." "Of course, ma'am." I'll make sure Innocent gets it exactly right." As Felicity walked away, Timothy noticed Princess Morgan watching from behind the counter, but her usual authority seemed diminished. At 52, Princess had been the head waitress for 15 years, but Timothy could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced nervously toward Wilson's office. The woman who used to run the front of house with confidence now seemed to walk on eggshells. Princess leaned over to whisper to another waitress, but her words carried a different tone than Timothy expected. "Wilson's been watching Felicity all week, writing down every little mistake. I tried to help her yesterday, but he told me to mind my own business or I'd be looking for a new job too." The other waitress nodded fearfully. "He's been like this since corporate started asking questions about our location, taking it out on everyone, especially the newer employees." Timothy's jaw tightened. This wasn't the protective team dynamic he'd expected to find. This was a workplace ruled by fear, where Wilson's paranoia about corporate scrutiny was creating a toxic environment for everyone. Through the kitchen window, he could see Innocent Cortez, barely 21 but already showing the skills of a master cook. But even Innocent, usually confident and energetic, seemed subdued. Timothy noticed the young man constantly glancing toward Wilson's office, his movements tense and hurried. Felicity approached another table where Jake Sullivan, a construction worker still covered in morning dust, was finishing his coffee. Jake was the kind of regular customer every diner treasured, kind, patient, and generous with tips. "More coffee, Jake?" "Always, sweetheart." "Hey, how's that hand treating you? I heard Wilson made you come in the day after you got hurt." Felicity's smile faltered for just a moment. "It's getting better every day. Thank you for asking." But Timothy could see the truth in her nervous glance toward Wilson's office, the way she quickly changed the subject. Jake's comment revealed something disturbing. Wilson had forced an injured employee to work immediately after her injury, showing no concern for her well-being or recovery. As his phone continued recording from his lap, Timothy began to understand that the rumors about Wilson weren't just gossip. They were warnings he should have heeded long ago. The small details painted a picture of systematic abuse. The way employees avoided eye contact with Wilson, the hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, the fear that permeated every interaction. Wilson Hayes emerged from his office, clipboard in hand, surveying his domain like a prison warden. Timothy watched as the entire atmosphere of the diner shifted. Conversations became quieter, movements more hurried, smiles more forced. This wasn't management. This was intimidation. "Felicity," Wilson's voice cut across the diner. "Table 7's been waiting 5 minutes for their check. Move." Timothy looked around. He was sitting at table 7, and he hadn't asked for his check. Wilson was manufacturing reasons to humiliate Felicity in front of customers and staff. 29 years ago, Timothy had worked under managers like Wilson. Bosses who used their power to crush spirits rather than build them. But he was watching now, recording everything, and what he was about to discover would prove that sometimes the most successful businesses are built on the suffering of the people who make them profitable. The rumors he'd been hearing weren't exaggerated. They were understated. And Felicity's broken hand was just the beginning of a story that would expose a culture of cruelty Timothy never knew existed in his own empire. Over the next hour, Timothy watched Wilson's reign of terror unfold in real time. Each time Felicity lifted the coffee pot, her face contorted in pain she thought no one could see, but Wilson showed no mercy. When she moved slower due to her injury, he publicly berated her. When she tried to help other staff members, he accused her of not focusing on her own work. The cast on her wrist had started to show stress fractures along the edges, suggesting she'd been forced to work far beyond what any doctor would recommend. But Wilson didn't care about medical recommendations. He cared about maintaining his iron grip on the staff through fear and intimidation. Timothy watched Wilson approach Princess Morgan near the register, his voice low but threatening. "Princess, I've told you before, if you can't control your staff, I'll find someone who can. Felicity's performance is reflecting poorly on all of us, and I won't have corporate breathing down my neck because you're too soft to do your job." Princess nodded reluctantly, her 15 years of experience meaning nothing in the face of Wilson's bullying. I understand, Wilson, but she's working as hard as she can with that injury. I don't want to hear excuses. Either she performs at full capacity or she's gone. And if you keep making excuses for her, you'll be gone too. Timothy's blood ran cold. Wilson wasn't just a bad manager. He was creating a hostile work environment that violated every principle of decent leadership. The rumors hadn't been about tough management. They'd been about abuse. As if sensing he was being watched, Felicity approached an elderly man sitting alone at table 3. Timothy recognized him as Mr. Rodriguez, a regular who usually ordered just coffee and toast. Today, the man was staring at the menu with obvious longing, but clearly couldn't afford more. What happened next revealed the kind of person Felicity truly was, despite the toxic environment she worked in. Without hesitation, she glanced around to make sure Wilson wasn't watching, then leaned down and whispered something to Mr. Rodriguez. A few minutes later, she returned with a full breakfast plate. "I told Innocent you were family," she said quietly. "This one's on the house." But Wilson had been watching from his office. He stormed out, his face red with fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed at Felicity, loud enough for nearby customers to hear. "You think you can give away food without my permission? That comes out of your paycheck." Timothy realized she was paying for that meal out of her own pocket. A woman who could barely afford her own expenses was feeding a stranger because it was the right thing to do. And Wilson was punishing her for showing basic human kindness. Later that evening, Timothy watched from his car as the last customer left. Wilson had gone home hours earlier, but Felicity remained, working alone in the empty diner. She moved through the space, wiping down tables, restacking chairs, her injured hand making every task take twice as long. Timothy realized Wilson had left her to close alone, despite her injury, as another form of punishment. Through the window, he could see her counting her tips at the end of the night, her lips moving as she calculated. She counted them 3 times, and each time, her shoulders dropped lower. Whatever amount she had, it wasn't enough, especially after Wilson's threat to dock her pay for helping Mr. Rodriguez. That's when her phone rang, and Timothy learned the true extent of her desperation. "Hello? Yes, this is Felicity Stokes." Her voice carried through the quiet diner. "What do you mean the rent is late? I sent a check." The conversation continued, and Timothy watched her face crumble. "I understand. Yes, I can have the rest by Friday. I promise." She hung up and immediately dialed another number. "Hi, it's Felicity. I know I said I'd send something this week for Emma's medical bills, but my manager threatened to dock my pay today." Her voice broke. "I know you've been patient. I just need a few more days." Timothy's hands gripped his steering wheel. Medical bills for someone named Emma, rent troubles, and a manager who was actively sabotaging her ability to earn the money she desperately needed. The truth hit him like a physical blow when he overheard her next phone call. "Hey, it's me. I know I'm supposed to be at the warehouse tonight, but my manager made me work a double shift, and my hand is really bad. Wilson said if I miss another day at the diner, he'll fire me." She paused, listening. "No, I understand. You need reliable people too." Wilson wasn't just making her life miserable at the diner. His abuse was affecting her second job, threatening her ability to earn the money she needed for her rent and Emma's medical bills. Timothy sat in stunned silence as he realized the full scope of Wilson's cruelty. This wasn't just bad management. This was systematic destruction of an employee's life, designed to maintain control through desperation and fear. 3 days later, Timothy decided to come back to continue his investigation. Timothy had positioned himself at a table near the kitchen where he could hear everything, and what he witnessed made his blood boil. Wilson called Felicity into the back office. "Felicity, corporate is asking questions about our performance metrics, and frankly, you're dragging us down," Wilson said, his voice cold and merciless. "The complaints about your service have been piling up. Mr. Hayes, I've been working as hard as I can despite my injury. If you could just give me a few more weeks." "I don't want to hear about your injury. That's your problem, not mine. You should have thought about that before taking a job you clearly can't handle." Before Wilson could continue his verbal assault, Felicity's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her face went white. "I'm sorry, I have to take this. It's my daughter's school." Her hands shook as she answered. "Hello? What do you mean?" She collapsed. "I'm on my way." She hung up and turned to Wilson, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter's at the hospital. I have to go. Please, I'll work extra shifts to make up for today. I promise." Wilson's response revealed the depth of his cruelty. "If you leave now, don't bother coming back. I'm tired of your constant excuses and emergencies." "My 8-year-old daughter is in the hospital," Felicity pleaded. "Not my problem. Choose, your job or your kid." That's when Timothy had heard enough. He was already standing up, his disguise forgotten, his fury barely contained. But what he discovered next would prove that Wilson's abuse extended far beyond one employee. It was a systematic pattern of cruelty that had been destroying lives while Timothy remained obliviously focused on profits. If you think you know where this story is going, you'll be shocked at what happened next. Hit that subscribe button, because what Timothy uncovers about his own business empire will shock you to your core. Timothy's investigation revealed that Wilson had been operating like a tyrant across multiple locations, using fear and intimidation to maintain artificially low labor costs and high productivity numbers. The efficient operations that looked so good on corporate reports were built on a foundation of employee suffering that Timothy never knew existed. At the hospital, Timothy watched Felicity rush to her daughter's bedside and what he learned about 8-year-old Emma's condition, and how Wilson's abuse had directly contributed to delaying her critical medical treatment, would become the catalyst for the complete transformation of his business empire. But the most devastating discovery was yet to come. When Timothy followed Felicity to her second job at his own warehouse, he realized that Wilson wasn't the only manager in his empire who ruled through cruelty. The culture of abuse extended throughout his businesses, creating a network of suffering he'd been blind to while counting profits. The broken hand that started this story wasn't just the result of workplace negligence. It was the direct result of unsafe conditions Wilson had created to cut costs, conditions that endangered every employee, but especially targeted those like Felicity who couldn't afford to complain. What Timothy discovered about his own complicity in this system of abuse, and how one woman's courage to endure it all for her daughter would ultimately save not just her own life, but the lives of countless other employees, would change everything he thought he knew about success, leadership, and what it truly means to build a business empire worth having. Timothy's hands trembled on the steering wheel as he followed the ambulance carrying Emma to the hospital. What he'd witnessed in that office, Wilson's callous disregard for a child's medical emergency, had shattered every assumption he'd made about the managers running his businesses. At the hospital, he watched from the waiting room as Felicity sat beside her daughter's bed, 8-year-old Emma looking fragile and pale against the white sheets. Through conversations with nurses, Timothy learned that Emma had a serious heart condition requiring surgery. Surgery that had been delayed for months due to financial constraints. The pieces fell together with sickening clarity. Wilson's systematic abuse hadn't just made Felicity's work life miserable, it had directly threatened her daughter's life by preventing her from earning enough money for critical medical care. But the most devastating discovery came when Timothy decided to investigate his other properties. Over the next week, he visited his warehouse, his retail stores, his other restaurant locations, all in disguise. What he found was a pattern of abuse that extended throughout his business empire. At the warehouse where Felicity worked her second job, Timothy discovered that the accident that broke her hand wasn't an accident at all. Manager Carl Morrison had been cutting safety protocols to meet productivity quotas, creating dangerous conditions that had already injured several workers. When Felicity saw a heavy crate falling toward Marcus, a teenage coworker, she'd thrown herself into harm's way because she knew the safety equipment that should have prevented the accident had been removed to save money. Carl Morrison, like Wilson Hayes, ruled through intimidation. Employees who complained about unsafe conditions were fired. Injury reports were buried or blamed on worker negligence. The impressive profit margins Timothy saw on his quarterly reports were built on a foundation of worker exploitation he'd never bothered to investigate. At his retail locations, Timothy found similar patterns. Managers who forced employees to work while sick, who denied bathroom breaks, who created impossible performance standards designed to justify terminations. His business empire wasn't successful because of good management. It was profitable because he'd unknowingly hired sociopaths who used fear and cruelty to extract maximum productivity at minimum cost. The memory of his mother hit him like a physical blow. Ellen Jones had worked for bosses like Wilson and Carl, had suffered in silence because she couldn't afford to lose her job, had smiled through pain because showing weakness meant losing everything. Timothy had built the very kind of business empire that had destroyed his mother's health and spirit. Some people are born fighters, his mother had said all those years ago. Not the kind who fight with their fists, but the kind who fight for everyone around them, even when no one's fighting for them. Felicity was that kind of fighter. Despite Wilson's abuse, despite the unsafe conditions at the warehouse, despite the financial pressure and her daughter's illness, she continued helping others. Timothy discovered she'd been quietly supporting not just innocent Cortez and his sick father, but several other employees across his various businesses who were facing their own crises. She'd been sharing her meager tips with warehouse workers whose hours had been cut. She'd been covering shifts for retail employees who couldn't afford to miss work for medical appointments. She'd been the invisible thread holding together the lives of people throughout Timothy's business empire, all while Wilson and managers like him actively worked to destroy her. Timothy realized that Princess Morgan's apparent hostility toward Felicity hadn't been prejudice, it had been fear. Princess had been trying to protect Felicity from Wilson's retaliation by maintaining emotional distance, knowing that any show of support would make them both targets for his abuse. Even innocent Cortez's quiet demeanor made sense now. The young cook wasn't naturally withdrawn. He was terrified of drawing Wilson's attention, knowing that any perceived mistake could result in losing the job that supported his entire family. The culture of fear Wilson had created affected every aspect of the business. Customer complaints weren't addressed properly because employees were afraid to report problems. Equipment repairs were delayed because maintenance staff feared being blamed for costs. Food quality suffered because kitchen workers were too intimidated to suggest improvements. Timothy had been measuring success by profit margins and efficiency metrics, never realizing that his successful businesses were actually failing in every way that mattered. Employee turnover was high, but managers like Wilson blamed it on worker laziness rather than acknowledging the toxic environment they'd created. Customer satisfaction scores were manipulated by managers who buried negative feedback and intimidated employees into not reporting problems. As Timothy sat in his car outside Emma's hospital room, watching Felicity hold her daughter's hand through the window, he faced the most important decision of his business career. He could fire Wilson and a few other bad managers, implement some new policies, and go back to his comfortable corporate office. Or he could acknowledge that the problem wasn't just a few bad employees. It was a system he'd created through his own neglect and indifference. The choice he made would determine not just Felicity and Emma's future, but the fate of hundreds of employees across his business empire who were suffering in silence, afraid to speak up, afraid to hope for better. The confrontation Timothy had been building toward finally arrived on a cold Thursday morning. But instead of confronting Wilson privately, Timothy made a decision that would shock everyone at Murphy's Diner. He walked in during the morning rush, removed his baseball cap, and announced in a voice loud enough for every customer and employee to hear. "I know, most of you don't know me because I lead anonymously. My name is Timothy Jones, and I own this restaurant," he said, showing his ID card. "I also own the warehouse where some of you work second jobs, and I'm here because I've learned some very disturbing things about how this business has been run." The silence that followed was deafening. Wilson's face went from confusion to terror as he realized his reign of abuse was over. Felicity, who had returned to work, despite Emma still being in the hospital because she couldn't afford to lose her job, stared in disbelief. "For the past month, I've been working undercover in my own businesses, and what I've discovered has sickened me," Timothy continued. I've watched managers create unsafe working conditions, abuse employees, and rule through fear and intimidation. I've learned that the efficiency I thought I was paying for was actually built on the suffering of good people who deserved better. Wilson tried to interrupt, but Timothy cut him off. Wilson Hayes, you're fired. Not just from this location. You're banned from working for any of my businesses ever again. The same goes for Carl Morrison at the warehouse and any other manager who thinks cruelty is an acceptable management strategy. But firing the bad managers was just the beginning. Over the next hour, Timothy announced a complete transformation of his business empire. He established the Ellen Jones Employee Assistance Program across all his companies, providing emergency financial aid, healthcare support, and career development opportunities for any employee facing hardship. More importantly, he implemented new oversight systems to ensure that managers were evaluated not just on profits, but on employee satisfaction, safety records, and ethical leadership. He created anonymous reporting systems so employees could report abuse without fear of retaliation. Timothy personally covered Emma's surgery costs, but that wasn't charity. It was justice. This company's negligence and abuse contributed to delaying your daughter's medical care, he told Felicity. Covering her expenses isn't generosity. It's taking responsibility for the harm my poor leadership allowed to happen. But Timothy's most surprising decision was promoting Felicity to Regional Employee Advocate, a new position he created specifically for her. I've watched you fight for everyone around you while everyone else looked the other way, he said. I want you to help me rebuild this company into something worthy of the people who work for it. Princess Morgan, freed from Wilson's reign of terror, returned to her natural leadership style, becoming a mentor for new employees rather than someone walking on eggshells. Innocent Cortez, no longer afraid to show his skills, was promoted to head chef and began implementing the food quality improvements he'd been too scared to suggest under Wilson's management. 6 months later, the transformation was remarkable. Employee turnover dropped by 80% across all of Timothy's businesses. Customer satisfaction scores reached all-time highs as employees, no longer afraid to report problems or suggest improvements, began taking pride in their work again. Productivity actually increased as workers no longer spent energy avoiding abusive managers and could focus on doing their jobs well. Emma's surgery was successful, her heart strong and healthy. She often visited the diner after school, doing homework at table 7. The same booth where her mother's courage had exposed a system of abuse and transformed an entire business empire. The story of Timothy's transformation spread throughout the business community. Other company owners began implementing similar oversight systems. Business schools started teaching case studies about the hidden costs of abusive management. The Department of Labor used Timothy's Employee Assistance Program as a model for new workplace protection initiatives. But the most meaningful change happened every morning when Timothy walked through his businesses. He no longer saw profit centers and efficiency metrics. He saw people with families, dreams, struggles, and an inherent dignity that no manager had the right to destroy in pursuit of profits. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button, because there are countless employees suffering in silence right now, working for managers who rule through fear and intimidation. Their stories deserve to be told, their courage deserves to be recognized, and their suffering deserves to be stopped.